Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where learning English becomes an unforgettable adventure through the lives of those who shaped our world. Today, we invite you into the story of a man who never shouted, but whose buildings spoke louder than words. A man born far from the centers of power, yet who rose to redesign the very skylines of the world. His name was Pei. You may not know his face, but you've likely seen his legacy in the sharp glass of the Louvre Pyramid in Paris, the clean symmetry of the Bank of China Tower in Hong Kong, or the quiet grace of the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. He didn't just build structures, he crafted symbols of culture, memory, and unity across continents. This isn't just a story of architecture. It's a journey of identity, courage, and vision. Of a boy from China who left home to chase beauty through structure. Of a man who faced prejudice, cultural isolation, and artistic rejection, yet transformed every challenge into creativity. It's a story that will not only improve your English, but inspire you to find meaning in your own voice, even when the world seems not to listen. If you'd like to support our work, you're welcome to like, comment, share, or join us. Every gesture helps us keep creating meaningful content for you. Get ready for one of the most powerful stories of vision and quiet determination. Let's begin. Pei was born in 1917 in the city of Guangzhou, China, during a time of great uncertainty. His full name was Ming Pei, but few outside his family would pronounce it correctly. His childhood unfolded against the backdrop of a fragile republic, a country still recovering from dynastic collapse, political fragmentation, and the early waves of modernization. His father, Pei, was a successful banker, eventually rising to head the Bank of China. That placed young Ming in a rare position. He had access to elite education, culture, and urban life. The Pei family moved to Shanghai when he was a child, and it was there that he first glimpsed the architectural tensions between East and West. The city, then under foreign concessions, was a place of colonial facades, traditional Chinese homes, and emerging skyscrapers. It was beautiful, chaotic, and divided, and it left a lasting impression. His mother, Lin Kun, was a deeply spiritual woman and a gifted flautist. She died when he was still a teenager, but her love for art and serenity stayed with him. Pei would later say that much of his aesthetic sensitivity came from her quiet presence and musical touch. Even as a child, he admired the elegance of gardens and temples, spaces where architecture met emotion. Still, becoming an architect was not an obvious choice. Architecture was not yet a formal profession in China, and there were few role models. But young Pei had a restless mind and a curious heart. He loved geometry, admired structure, and found fascination in the balance between discipline and beauty. When he looked at buildings, he saw more than walls, he saw rhythm. By the 1930s, political instability and the rising threat of Japanese invasion pushed many elite Chinese families to consider education abroad. Pei, ambitious and supported by his father, set his eyes on the United States. He was just 17 when he sailed across the Pacific to study at the University of Pennsylvania. He knew little English. He had no relatives waiting. But he carried something more important, a belief that the language of structure could transcend borders. Can a young man far from home build not only his future, but also a new way of seeing the world? Pei didn't just cross an ocean, he crossed cultural boundaries, and stepped into a new kind of challenge. What he didn't yet know was that America would offer both freedom and friction, and that his struggle to belong would become the very soil from which his greatest works would grow. Arriving in the United States in 1935, Pei found himself in a world that was both exciting and alien. He was just a teenager, barely fluent in English, trying to find his place among confident American students. His early experience was a mix of wonder and isolation. He enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania with the hope of studying architecture. But the curriculum felt rigid, and the atmosphere didn't suit him. The designs being taught were still rooted in classical revival, columns, symmetry, repetition. It lacked the energy and modernity that had first inspired him back in Shanghai. He wanted buildings that spoke to the future, not ones that echoed the past. Disappointed, he transferred to MIT, a school known more for engineering than for art. There, he studied architecture formally, but again, the challenge wasn't just academic. He struggled with the coldness of the New England winters, the emotional distance of classmates, and the pressure to succeed in a language that was not his own. Each essay, every technical drawing, became a test of both intellect and perseverance. And yet, he endured. He became fascinated by the emerging ideas of modernism, the clean lines of Le Corbusier, the bold vision of Bauhaus, and the revolutionary thinking of Walter Gropius. These weren't just architects, they were dreamers of a new order. They believed that design could solve social problems, that buildings could shape how people lived, worked, and thought. Still, as a young Chinese man in 1930s America, Pei was viewed as an outsider. Architecture, like many professions at the time, was deeply dominated by white men. Even at MIT, where his skills were undeniable, some professors saw his talent as unusual, even surprising, not because of his designs, but because of where he came from. He often found himself working twice as hard to earn half the recognition. And yet, beneath that pressure, something remarkable was happening. His vision was sharpening. His cultural duality, East and West, began to blend into a unique perspective. Where others saw conflict, he began to see bridges. It's easy to feel invisible when the world doesn't yet have a place for you. But what if the very feeling of being in between cultures, ideas, and traditions was the key to creating something entirely new? In 1940, he graduated with a degree in architecture. But then the world changed. World War II began pulling students and professionals into national service. Pei joined the National Defense Research Committee, applying his skills to scientific research for the war effort. Though far from the drawing board, this experience taught him how to work on large-scale projects, coordinate complex systems, and think globally. But the real turning point was yet to come, not in war, but in mentorship. Because one day, Pei would walk into a lecture hall at Harvard and meet someone who would change his path forever. In 1942, Pei was admitted to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. It was more than a step forward, it was a leap into a world of possibility. There, under the guidance of Walter Gropius, one of the founding figures of the Bauhaus movement, Pei found the mentorship he had long been searching for. Gropius didn't just teach architecture, he taught thinking. He pushed his students to explore how design could respond to society, to emotion, to function, and to time itself. For Pei, this was electrifying. He was no longer just drawing, he was learning how to listen through architecture. To let a building speak. To let light, space, and material form a kind of silent poetry. But the war was still raging, and Harvard wasn't immune. Classmates left for military service. Resources were scarce. Even so, Pei stayed on, absorbing every ounce of modernist philosophy. When the war finally ended, he joined the faculty and began teaching. For the first time, he was no longer a quiet student. He had become a voice in shaping the next generation of architects. Yet teaching wasn't his only calling. He yearned to build, to leave a mark in the real world. In 1948, a surprising opportunity arrived. William Zeckendorf, a bold real estate developer in New York City, was looking for fresh architectural talent. Zeckendorf believed cities needed a new look, and he wanted someone who could combine vision with discipline. He hired Pei to lead the architectural division of his firm, Webb and Knapp. It was an unusual move. Pei had no major buildings to his name. He was young, untested in the business world. But Zeckendorf saw something in him, a precision, a boldness, a calm certainty. This was Pei's first real battlefield. Designing under corporate pressure meant balancing art with deadlines, budgets, and politics. He worked on massive urban projects, including public housing developments, universities, and civic centers. In those early years, he learned how to collaborate, how to lead teams, and how to stand his ground when creativity was threatened by compromise. Some critics dismissed his early buildings as too plain. Others questioned his choices. But Pei never raised his voice. He believed that good architecture was a long conversation, not a loud argument. Slowly, people began to notice his style, clean geometry, sensitivity to context, respect for light and shadow. His buildings didn't shout for attention. They invited you to look again. What does it take to remain true to your vision when the world around you demands conformity? Through every challenge, Pei held fast to one belief, that architecture was not about ego, but about harmony. Not about the architect's name, but about how the structure makes people feel. By the 1950s, he had quietly built a reputation. But the world still didn't know his name. That would soon change. Because on the horizon, there waited an invitation, one that would take him from the crowded blocks of American cities to a place of memory, healing, and global recognition. And with it, a challenge unlike any he had ever faced before. It was the 1980s, and Pei had already built a quiet legacy of modernist structures across the United States, from university buildings to elegant civic centers. But one day, he received a phone call that would shake the foundation of his career. The president of France had a vision to transform the Louvre, one of the world's most beloved museums, and to bring it into the modern era. And for this task, he chose an unlikely figure, a Chinese-American architect from across the ocean. When news broke that Pei had been selected to lead the redesign of the Louvre, the French public exploded with criticism. A foreigner? An American? An outsider to French culture and heritage? The media was relentless. The artistic elite were offended. Protests erupted. Letters poured in. People feared he would destroy the classical soul of the museum. Some even called it architectural betrayal. Pei was 66 years old. He had faced hardship before, discrimination, doubt, silence. But this was different. It was personal. For the first time, his work was being politicized on an international stage. He did not retreat. Instead, Pei spent months in Paris, not designing, but listening. He walked through the Louvre's corridors, studied its layers of history, spoke with curators and historians, and tried to understand not just the building, but what it meant to the people of France. What he proposed next would spark one of the fiercest debates in the history of modern architecture, a glass pyramid. It was not just bold, it was blasphemous, according to critics. The Louvre was a palace of kings. It had Baroque facades, Renaissance halls, and deep national memory. To place a modern glass pyramid in its central courtyard felt, to many, like a scar. But Pei saw something different. He saw an ancient symbol, the pyramid, reborn through modern transparency. He saw geometry that respected symmetry, and light that invited visitors inward. He believed that the structure would not overpower the Louvre, but offer clarity, coherence, and accessibility to its fragmented layout. The battle was not quick. It took years of meetings, debates, revisions. Pei worked with calm persistence, refusing to justify himself with anger or ego. Instead, he let the design speak. He refined every angle, every material, every proportion, until it no longer demanded to be accepted, but invited it. In 1989, the pyramid was completed. The transformation was stunning. As light filtered through the glass and reflected on the stone, a new harmony emerged, the old and the new, side by side. Visitors who had once resisted now stood in awe. The Louvre Pyramid became not only accepted, but beloved. It was a symbol of France's willingness to evolve, and of architecture's power to reconcile history with the future. What gives someone the courage to create when surrounded by doubt? The Louvre project was more than a design. It was a turning point, a test of cultural sensitivity, creative conviction, and quiet bravery. And in the end, it didn't just change the Louvre. It changed Pei. He once said, "Success is a collection of problems solved." The pyramid, standing sharp and serene in the heart of Paris, was proof of that. But his journey was far from over. In fact, a new calling would soon draw him back toward the east, to reconnect with heritage, history, and the memory of a place he once called home. In the early 2000s, Pei was already a legend. He was in his 80s, a time when most architects had long retired. And yet, one project called to him like no other, the creation of a museum that would honor Islamic art and culture, situated in Doha, Qatar. At first, he declined. He had no expertise in Islamic architecture, he said. He didn't want to fake understanding or design from a place of ignorance. But the Emir of Qatar insisted, not because of fame, but because of Pei's integrity. They wanted someone who would approach the project not just with skill, but with reverence. And so, Pei accepted. But not in haste. He embarked on a journey across the Islamic world, from Cairo to Damascus, from Granada to Samarkand, studying the geometry of mosques, the light of courtyards, the philosophy behind arches and domes. He wasn't copying, he was listening. And learning. This was no ordinary commission. It was a spiritual test, to capture centuries of faith and tradition in a modern structure without arrogance. And for Pei, it was deeply personal. It reminded him of his youth in China, of temples and balance, of silence and harmony. Once again, he was walking between worlds. But the task was overwhelming. He faced pressure from patrons, deadlines from governments, and doubts from scholars. He was nearly blind in one eye. His body, once steady at the drafting table, now trembled with age. But still, he pressed on. The location itself became a battle. Pei rejected all proposed sites. None of them, he felt, honored the gravity of the museum's mission. Eventually, he chose a solitary man-made island off the coast of Doha, isolated, facing the sea. A space where the building could breathe, reflect, and belong. He designed a structure that was both striking and restrained, a cube crowned with a delicate dome, inspired by the 8th century mosque of Ibn Tuluan in Cairo. The light would pour in from above. The materials would be stone, glass, and water. The architecture would not overwhelm, but invite contemplation. But here was the real sacrifice. For Pei, this might be his last major work. Every decision he made carried the weight of finality. He labored for years, not for fame, not for money, but to honor a culture not his own. To prove that architecture could be a form of respect. Why would a man in the twilight of life take on such an immense burden? Perhaps because he knew that understanding others is the highest form of creation. And that to build something lasting, one must be willing to surrender ego for empathy. When the Museum of Islamic Art opened in 2008, it was hailed as a masterpiece, not just of design, but of soul. Even critics who had once dismissed Pei now bowed to the purity of his vision. It was, many said, the perfect fusion of East and West, of history and future. In this act of quiet brilliance, Pei had done more than create a museum. He had bridged civilizations. But beneath the triumph, there was a silent truth. This was his final bow. The long road he had walked, from Shanghai to Harvard, from the Louvre to Doha, was drawing to a close. And yet, his voice would not disappear. Because the buildings he left behind would keep speaking, to strangers, to students, to cities still learning how to see. By the time Pei reached the peak of his career, he had not only created iconic buildings but also quietly reshaped how the world understood architecture. His design stood across continents, sleek yet respectful, bold yet timeless. Each project was not just a building, but a story told through form, light, and space. From the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. to the Bank of China Tower in Hong Kong, his work carried a universal language that transcended borders. The Louvre Pyramid, however, became his most recognized and controversial achievement. At first, many in France were outraged. They saw the modern glass structure as an insult to their historic treasure. But Pei, with his calm precision, stood by his vision. He understood that time would tell the truth. And it did. Today, the pyramid is not only accepted, it is loved. It became the symbol of the Louvre itself, visited by millions, admired by architects, and embraced by the public. This triumph was more than artistic, it was philosophical. Pei proved that the past and the future could talk to each other, if one listens deeply enough. He didn't erase tradition. He illuminated it with light. Pei also received global recognition. He won the Pritzker Architecture Prize in 1983, the highest honor in his field. But instead of celebrating himself, he dedicated the award to the mentors and traditions that shaped him. In his speech, he said, "I am always learning. Architecture is not just building. It's living. It's feeling." He continued designing into his 90s, creating cultural centers, museums, and memorials with the same devotion. He was never chasing trends. Instead, he focused on purpose. Whether in Dallas or Doha, his structures invited reflection, connection, and peace. But perhaps his greatest achievement was not in stone or steel. It was in staying true to himself. Pei never compromised his values. He worked with humility, precision, and empathy. He believed that architecture should serve people, that a building must welcome its users, not overwhelm them. He saw light not just as an element, but as a soul that breathes life into space. He once said, "I want to bring people together, not push them apart." And in a world often divided, his work became quiet bridges between cultures, times, and ideas. Looking back, Pei's victory was not loud. It was lasting. He didn't just shape skylines. He shaped how we see beauty. He didn't chase fame. He earned trust. And he didn't just build buildings. He built meaning. In the later years of his life, Pei no longer rushed to build taller, grander structures. Instead, he moved with quiet purpose, focusing on meaning, not just scale. His legacy was not simply a collection of glass and concrete, but a philosophy, carved into space and light. Each of his buildings told a story. Not about him, but about where they stood. He believed architecture should serve the place, not dominate it. That belief echoed in the peaceful courtyards of the Suzhou Museum in China, where he embraced traditional Chinese garden principles and reimagined them through modern forms. The museum, located in his ancestral hometown, was more than a project, it was a homecoming. It was where modern lines met ancient soul. Pei's work was a conversation, between East and West, between old and new, between what we remember and what we dream of. He once said, "A building has to have a sense of time, and a sense of place." For him, architecture wasn't about ego, it was about listening, to the land, to history, to culture. And yet, the world noticed him. He received the Pritzker Architecture Prize, often referred to as the Nobel of Architecture, in 1983. In their words, he had given this century some of its most beautiful interior spaces and exterior forms. But perhaps the deeper honor came from those who walked through his buildings and felt something stir, peace, awe, curiosity. He designed for experience, not just appearance. Even after retirement, he never truly stopped. Well into his 90s, he worked on selected projects that touched his heart, places where he could give back. One of his final works, the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, was a spiritual journey in itself. Inspired by the light of the desert and the geometry of Islamic art, the building floats on water, timeless and dignified. When asked about legacy, Pei was characteristically humble. He did not seek fame. He sought connection. He hoped people would feel something honest in his work, that architecture could bridge people, cultures, and generations. His buildings did not shout for attention. They whispered with grace. And somehow, the world listened. Pei's life is not just the story of buildings. It is the story of vision rising from simplicity. Of East meeting West, not in conflict, but in quiet harmony. He showed the world that elegance can be found in geometry, and that timeless ideas don't need to shout, they only need to stand tall. From his early days walking narrow streets in Suzhou to designing skylines that would redefine modern cities, Pei taught us that where we begin does not define where we end. What matters is the clarity of our purpose, and the courage to keep building, even when others can't see what we see. If his story has moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe in quiet determination and bold dreams. Let Pei's life be a reminder that beauty can be crafted not only in concrete and steel, but in how we shape the world with integrity, patience, and grace. And if you're inspired to learn more about the extraordinary lives behind the landmarks we take for granted, we invite you to subscribe, comment, and join our journey through stories that go beyond fame, stories that reveal the heart behind the achievement. Until next time, keep learning, keep creating, and keep believing in the power of your ideas to shape something lasting. Goodbye for now, and may your path, like Pei's, be guided by light, purpose, and the joy of building something meaningful.